Good evening, good morning, YouTube. Salutations, wherever you're at. So recently, you may have seen in one of my videos that I had announced that I was going to participate in the new BookTube event, March on the Rails, which I think is really interesting. There's quite a few channels that are hosting it. It's Alan Reed's, Infinite Text, Deb at Rainer Reads, and Ghost Readers in the Sky. I may have gotten the last name wrong. I'll link and tag them all of them in the description. I've checked out all their channels. All of them have very interesting videos. I really like Alan's channel a lot. He talks a lot about he reads a lot of natural history books, which I also like. So, but they're all great channels. I want to say Ghost Reader. He reads a lot of westerns, which I love westerns. So, anyway, so I just wanted to kind of talk about what I started a little bit early. I had just finished something up. I think at the time I started, it was like February 26th or something, and I actually ended up reading the book really fast. So, and I don't own a physical copy of it. I read a digital version of it, so I'll put the cover right here. This is Christian Wolmar's Railways The Raj. I do own books of Christian Wolmar, so I'll show those real quick. And I actually found my copies of Engines of War, and I'll just kind of show these off real quick. Because all of these have fantastic maps in it, so, and I just love maps. And train maps are always interesting because they very much have an economical tie to a place, to a country, or wherever they're at. Here's one of the rail in South Africa. This is a phenomenal book. This Engines of War. It covers a lot of the use of rail and war, and it covers a bunch of different ones. The Russo-Japanese War, the Boer War, Boer, B-O-E-R War, which was like the British in South Africa fighting the native Dutch people there, Afrikaners. Anyway, but it covers a whole bunch of stuff like that. This is an excellent book. It's been a few years since I've read it. I wouldn't mind rereading it though. And then of course, this is actually one of my favorite nonfiction books of all time. This is To the Edge of the World. It's been about 4 or 5 years since I've read this, so I'm actually planning on reading this too. I'm going to reread this, even though Christian Wolmar has other books I'd like to read. So I'll go ahead and talk about the Railways of the Raj. This was a really excellent book. I don't know that much about Indian history, and so I'll just quickly say for any. So most people who have been following my channel know I read a lot of nonfiction. The majority of my reading is nonfiction, and one of the reasons I got into the kind of railway history is because I like history, and if you are interested in nonfiction or even just in trains, even a little bit, trains have played a massive role in human history. I mean, it's hard to really state just how important they've been, but obviously they are like a symbol of the Industrial Revolution. Like if you look up Industrial Revolution pictures, you're going to see a lot of rail, a lot of steam engine rail. And I just thought this was really interesting. So anyway, it's just, they play such a big role in, not just in warfare, but economics, geography, just all kinds of stuff. So, the Railways in the Raj, one thing, and something else about Christian Wolmar, any of these rails he talks about, he has often gone and been on at least some of the network, maybe not the entire network of some of these, because some of these have thousands and thousands of miles of rail, but he at least does some journeying on these rail lines that he talks about. I know he did the Trans-Siberian one. He did a lot of the rails in India. I'm certain he's probably ridden on every rail line in the UK because he is a British author. Of course, a lot of my audience is probably going to be American, and in the United States, rail doesn't play as big of a role, especially in human transport. We don't have high-speed rail in the United States like they do in most other parts of the world. But even just in the U.S., like this Engines of War, this covers a lot of the American Civil War, and I know a lot of history people, at least in my part of the world, really like American Civil War stuff. One of the reasons the Union Army was so successful was because of rail. The Southern, the Confederates, the Southern states did not have the rail infrastructure that the Union Army did. The Northern states wasn't even close. So there is actually a map in here of that. But anyway, so I'll get back to the Railways on the Raj. So what I've so it just kind of starts out talking about There's a really great introduction of Chris and Wolmar talking about the experience of being on the Indian Rail, but it's just really interesting, man. Obviously, and that's one of the reasons why I like this is because it starts with the East India Company, and then the England's government eventually takes over the building of the rail line. And like I said, that's kind of the history parts I like of it. One, I just think the history of the East India Company is just fascinating. They were actually a bit against building rail at the time because they didn't think it'd make money. But a lot of business tycoons in England did, especially like steel manufacturers and all kinds of stuff. But so there was some debate about building it there in the first place. And of course, at this time, England was like the leading country in the world of rail line and building rail and rail engineers. So, of course, they were really big on building the rail in India. And so eventually they do. And a lot of it starts with them just wanting to, one of the main motives at first for the English government is because of the, if you know anything about the British Empire's history in India, they never really had a whole lot of soldiers there. And so one of the points of logic for them was that with fewer soldiers, if they had rail there, they could transport them quicker from one place to another. And this leads to a whole other bunch of other stuff, debates about rail gauge, what to use, because if they want to transport a bunch of soldiers and artillery and stuff, like they want to use a wider gauge because it's a more stable base. But a more narrow gauge is much cheaper to build. So there's always debate about what size gauge to use. Of course, and another reason the British Empire was so interested in building the rail in India was because of, if you know any British Empire history, you might know what the Great Game is, which is England's, the British Empire's rivalry with the Russian Empire, and they were worried about their encroachment from the north. But again, just another thing I find really interesting about it is just what it takes to build these rail lines. Some of the debate in India was, the weather. They didn't know how rail would hold up there. It would, because metal forging techniques were very different at this time. They were still developing, and they weren't sure if it would cause rust, how wood would do, because there's a lot of wood usually involved in rail lines as well. So they weren't sure. They thought the weather patterns would not be conducive to the life of the rail line. And they literally moved mountains to build this thing. I'm talking like they are literally blowing mountains up to make level ground to build this rail. Because they were really big on trying to build rail up into the Punjab region. Because again, this was a big part of, for the British Empire, building this rail was a way for them to project power. I talked about this when I talked about To the Edge of the World a little bit, but that's how the Russians were really able to solidify their hold on, Siberia and Eastern Russia. As obviously those vast distances, it makes it very difficult to move men and artillery and anything over those, like I said, over those vast distances. So it very much increased their ability to project power in those regions. Of course, the Indian geography is very different to the, English geography. Obviously, India is it's a huge country. I might put up a little image here, but India is actually much bigger north-south than the United States is. And of course, when you're going north-south, weather patterns are going to change quite a bit from the bottom to the top. And of course, in modern Indian geography, over on the other side of Bangladesh, there's like a little break off of the Indian country right there. So once that happened, there's a whole chapter about how they had to rebuild a bunch of rail to be able to get to that region, to get through that little strip right there, which is like, I want to say as thin as like 55, 60 miles at some point. So it's just a little narrow passage right there to get the, I don't want to call it the wrong thing. I'm sorry, my Indian geography is not perfect. I thought they were calling it the Bengali region, but I feel like Bengali is Bangladesh. So I could be wrong about that. Anyway. So, of course, India has a massive population. And again, one of the interesting parts is just what it took to build these rail lines. Obviously, lots of Indians worked on these rail lines. And there was a whole lot of problems when it came to actually getting people to work on this rail line. Because India is not a homogenous country. In the United States, I think a lot of average Americans or just people in the U.S. or maybe even the English-speaking world tend to think of the rest of the world to be like us, where everyone speaks the same language. and our cultures are all very similar in our country, where India is not like that. There's a big divide between, Hindi and Muslim communities, which is the two biggest ones, but it cuts much deeper than that. But that's just a very obvious one. And at the time of the British being there, India was still very much under their caste system, which is just like, ranking of people and people groups. And so they had all these these cultural leanings of not wanting to work with each other. There's stories of if it didn't matter if it was in the story, it's a European who drinks from a water bottle, but the Indians, but it could have been anybody from a different caste system, and the Indian took it and immediately threw it off of the train because he didn't, because they thought it would, I don't know, taint them or whatever. And obviously the British Empire did a lot of bad stuff, but to their credit, they did try their best to kind of work with these cultural differences, although they did tend to, they did other things that kind of bypass that. Obviously, they would break them up and have them work on different parts, and did some other things. There's some really great chapters about how they divided up first, second, and third class. Because in Indian culture, there's a whole bunch of stuff about women not being able to look at other men and other men, especially men of these other ethnicities or people groups. It's just incredibly fascinating, man. And of course, because of the incredible heat and stuff that takes place in India, thousands and thousands of people died building this rail. I thought I saw a number of almost 10, at least, it was 9,000 people died working on this rail, and I think it was much more. And that might have just been their initial first rail line, because at first they do it as an experiment, and they only build about 500 miles of rail. But then that original rail line ends up going over 4,000 or 5,000 miles of rail, something like that. I'm sorry, I might have those numbers a little off. Now there's a whole lot more than that. But the point is, and to this day, rail line is very, very popular in India. And then towards the end of the book, it also talks about Indian independence and how the rail played a big part in that too. And then the Indian government taking over the rail. And there's a lot of debate about, is privatization better than the government? If it's private, they tend to be more efficient with dollars spent, but they're not always doing everything in the best interest of the people. Whereas if the government does it, they are doing everything in the best interest of the people, but they tend to not be nearly as efficient with their dollars. So there's a lot of debate there about which works better. It seems like for rail that the government-owned rail tends to do better overall, but even if there is a lot of wasted money. There is also another incredible stat. I want to say, oh man, it's something ridiculous. 2,000 people a year are killed just by being hit by rail. And then there was another section talked about how it was a popular way to dispose of murdered bodies. They would just throw them in front of the rail, and once you're hit by the train, obviously it destroys all the evidence. Anyway, it was just a fantastic book, man. I really enjoyed it. I read it in 2 days, so I'm already finished with it. I think at the time of this recording, it's February 28th or something like that. So I technically finished it right before March started. I didn't think I'd read it so fast, but I was really interested in it. And like I said, I plan on reading. I'm going to reread to The Edge of the World. I'm going to reread this. I think that's what I'm going to do for sure, because I really enjoy this book a lot. Although he has several others I'm interested in too. I did pick up Fire and I've read this. This is Fire and Steam. This is about the rail history of the rail in England. But he's got a bunch of other really interesting books. He's got another one about the United States in World War II. How rail played a big role there. Obviously, the United States, that was a foreign war for the U.S., but just kind of, most people probably know this about World War II history, but part of the reason the U.S. was so successful was that it's able to just mass produce and overwhelm, the German army, the German military, or really the Axis, just with how much supplies, tanks, and all that stuff they could produce and ship quickly to these foreign theaters. There's a crazy stat out there about there was four. I don't even know if I want to say the number. It's so ridiculous. Maybe it's 200,000, 250,000 Jeeps, or American Jeeps, were in Europe during the time of the World War II, and they actually just left most of them there because it was cheaper to leave them there than it was to ship them back, which is ridiculous. But it was something for every 2 soldiers or something crazy like that. For every 2 or 3 soldiers, there was a Jeep. I want to say it was per 2 soldiers, there was 1 Jeep. American soldiers, at least. Anyway, which is an amazing statistic. That has nothing to do with trains. But anyway, I just wanted to talk about that Railways on the Raj. I thought this was very good. Again, my knowledge of Indian history was very limited, but it did make me want to learn more, because this basically just starts obviously at the British Empire, but India has thousands of years of history, kind of like China. China has a literary history that goes back a very long time that, we just don't think of much as Westerners. But anyway, that's all for today, YouTube. Good night, good day, wherever you're at. Check out March on the Rails. I think it's a very cool event. Maybe you don't want to read a mammoth this month. I definitely recommend March on the Rails. I think it's a really cool event. So good night, good day, wherever you're at.